to be continuing talking about organic chemistry. So biochemistry is the study of how chemistry relates to life. Organic chemistry, it turns out, examines molecules that have CHO, or carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen in them. And so we're going to be looking at our first set of organic molecules by looking at carbohydrates. So in the last lecture we were talking about what is carbon, why is carbon kind of the backbone of living molecules, the carbon skeleton, and what can be added onto a carbon skeleton to make the molecule more diverse, to be able to have different functions. And that's why we talked about functional groups, because they change the function of the molecule. One of the other things that we talked about is how to build larger molecules. So if we start out with a simple monomer or subunit, we can build larger molecules through a process called dehydration synthesis. So the first one that we're going to talk about is called carbohydrates. And I like the name because I think the name tells you something. It actually tells you that carbohydrates are made of carbon, oxygen, and hydrogen, or CHO. So the name carbohydrate tells you actually what it is made of. Those are the only elements that will be found in a carbohydrate. And so it's made of CHO, and these can be found linear or in rings. Now, if you take organic chemistry, you'll learn how to name organic compounds, but we're going to focus just on one prefix and one suffix, one beginning of a word and one end of a word. That will help us recognize if we're talking about a carbohydrate. Carbohydrates can begin with the prefix gly, prefix, or they can end with the prefix -ose. So they can begin with gly or they can end with -ose. And so we'll see, for example, sucrose, cellulose, all end in -ose, and that tells us that it's a carbohydrate. The prefix glycogen, or the word glycogen, the prefix glycosidic. These are all words that are going to give you a hint that we're talking about something that includes a sugar. We'll see the word peptidoglycan. Peptid refers to proteins, but glyc refers to sugar. So if you see gly or -ose, you know that it has to do with a carbohydrate, sometimes also called sugars. The job of carbohydrates, what is the function? So what it's made of is really its structure. What it does is really its function. The main functions are going to be energy and structural components. Energy and structural. I'm not sure whether you like the darker or the lighter, the heavier or the lighter. And so we're going to see that living organisms are going to use carbohydrates both as a source of energy and to be able to build more complex structures. This last picture is actually ribose. If you remember ribonucleic acids or deoxyribonucleic acids, ribose and deoxyribose are sugars. They are what's going to make up part of the sugar phosphate backbone of DNA. So we're going to see carbohydrates all throughout living organisms. We want to talk about a few that you need to know. One of the ones you need to know are some monosaccharides. Now, mono means one, and a monosaccharide is a one sugar. The main one that we will focus on is glucose, and glucose's molecular formula is C6 H12O6. And you do need to memorize glucose. You'll recognize this OSE here. We're going to see glucose all throughout the year. One of the big things about monosaccharides is they are quick sources of energy. So they are quick energy. Because the molecule is easy to break down. So glucose, fructose, galactose, these are all examples of monosaccharides. The only one you really need to memorize is glucose, recognizing that it's a carbohydrate, recognizing that it's there for quick energy. If we use dehydration synthesis, we can build larger molecules, what we call macro molecules. A disaccharide will have two. So sucrose, table sugar, the sugar that you are used to seeing, sucrose is a disaccharide. This link here between the two is called a glycosidic linkage. And you do need to be able to recognize that part of the word gly or glyco. Glycosidic linkage is the name of the bond that holds monosaccharides together to form either di or poly, which means many. So we can have a single carbohydrate, we can have a disaccharide, or we can have polysaccharides. And polysaccharides are sometimes even going to be in the thousands. We're going to spend just a little bit of time looking at some important polysaccharides that you need to memorize and know. But keep in mind, all of this has to do with what is it made of? Carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. So we have a lot of bonds here. When you look at these atoms, you see a lot of bonds. And what we need to keep in mind is a bond represents electrons. Electrons are a source of energy. So by breaking these bonds, that's how we get energy. So we're going to move forward and look at two other molecules that are sources of energy. But these two are actually sources of long-term energy. Starch and glycogen are both polysaccharides. They're both polysaccharides, P-O-L-Y. But they're also used for long-term energy storage. Meaning that the organism is going to build polysaccharides to store their energy for when they might need it at a later date. For humans, if we're hungry, we go out and eat. But keep in mind that for most animals, you can't go to the grocery store and get food if you're hungry. It has to be around, it has to be available. If you're a plant, you have to have the sun and water to be able to make your own food. So, most organisms are going to store energy. Starch is how plants store energy. So plants build a polysaccharide to store the monosaccharides. And we call that starch. And this is what starch looks like. Now this is just a small part of the thousands that can be combined. Keep in mind each of these is a glycosidic linkage. Keep in mind that each bond represents potential energy that is there. Now starch, if you think about starchy foods, you think about plants. These are potatoes. These are carrots. This is corn. So starch is found in plants. Now glycogen is how animals store their monosaccharides. And this is glycogen. Glycogen is branched. And so if you look at starch, starch is linear, and glycogen is branched. So they're similar. They're both made of many monosaccharides. But they're different in that starch is made by plants in a linear form. Glycogen is made by animals, and it's in a branched form. Now we'll talk more about this later, but glycogen is actually stored in the animal in the liver and the muscle. And that should make some sense to us, right? One of the highest needs of energy by an animal's body are the muscles. And so to store your extra carbohydrates there is a very convenient storage place. So we said that you are a carbohydrate if you are made of CHO. And your CHO is going to be arranged into these ring shapes. You can be a monosaccharide, a disaccharide, a polysaccharide. You can be a linear polysaccharide called starch that is used by plants to store energy. You can be a branched polysaccharide called glycogen that is used by animals to store energy. Energy is one of the reasons that that organisms use carbohydrates. But then we also have the ability of structure. So carbohydrates can provide structure. And so this is again under poly, so these are polysaccharides, one of which is cellulose. I'm sorry, there's a spelling error there. Cellulose. Cellulose is made by plants. Made by plants. So is starch. Here's starch, here's cellulose. If you look closely, they're both made of monosaccharides, but it turns out that cellulose has a slightly different way of linking them. Cellulose has what are called beta linkages. And these linkages alternate direction. Starch, the linkages are all in the same direction, and these are alpha linkages. Like alphabet, but alpha meaning first. And I kind of remember that with the A in starch, A in alpha. So they're made out of the same things, but they have very different functions. Cellulose is in plant cell walls. This is what gives plants their extra structure and support. So a very strong carbohydrate there. Now, one of the important things is that animals can digest starch. Digest starch. But they cannot digest cellulose. And this all has to do with the direction of the linkages. If you remember anything about enzymes, enzymes are specific. They only fit certain shapes. These are actually differently shaped molecules. And so cellulose is a great source of fiber because it passes through the system undigested. Some animals have special adaptations to help them digest. Now, real quickly, chitin and peptidoglycan are also structural polysaccharides. Chitin is found in fungi cell walls. Fungi cell walls and insect exoskeletons. Peptidoglycan is found in bacterial cell walls. And so you'll see this peptidoglycan. Bacteria cell walls have peptidoglycan. So the big thing that we want to take away is we have carbohydrates. And carbohydrates are able to serve a lot of different functions. One that we're going to talk about more tomorrow that is not on here is that carbohydrates can serve as ID tags. And so we'll talk more about that tomorrow, ID tags. The big thing is, what are carbohydrates and what are they used